Evening, everybody. How's everyone doing today? Let me know if you can see everything okay. I think just my view in OBS is kind of weird right now, so just having a little trouble seeing everything. Awesome. Perfect. All right, guys. So today we are kind of going to pick up a little bit where we left off on Tuesday's class. I'm gonna talk to you guys a little bit about the fundamentals of animation and how to use them within After Effects, because since After Effects is the main program that we use in this course. And so I'm going to be going through what keyframes are, what time is, and what your timeline is in relation to animation and things like that today. And so this class might be a little bit shorter than what normal classes are. It might go the full length. It just kind of depends on how much we get to today. And then I've decided that next week's class on Tuesday is when we're going to start our first project with the balls, the bouncing balls. So I hope everyone's kind of excited, though. Let me just get some stuff pulled up here. A couple things I want to note. The first thing is that the channel name has changed. I did send an announcement out earlier today that was talking about how it changed from ART 184 with Farina, with Dr. Casey Farina's name, and now we changed it to the correct name of the class because they've changed the codes to the class. Now, instead of ART, they're AVC. And so we just have that correct. So if you guys are looking for it, that's the new name of it. If you already signed up and already putting stuff into Slack, you don't have to worry. You're already in the channel, but if you're going to look for the channel to sign up and do your assignment, this is the new name for it, and so you want to check that one. The other thing is that I'm really enjoying seeing your guys' artwork and different stuff that you're doing inside of Slack that you guys have been posting. I've seen some really cool, interesting stuff in there, so I'm excited to see you guys apply those skills into this class. Let me think. There was one other thing I had put last class. I said that I would do this, and I almost forgot until late last night, which is always how it is, right? I'm always like, oh no, I've almost forgotten something. With the file structure, I said that I would give you guys a template. And so I created one for you. If you guys just want to go into that module, like if I click it and you go to file structure, don't worry about all this. We're in the teacher view right now. So, and then you just go into the file structure assignment, and then you can download this. And I will download it right now and just kind of quickly walk you guys through it. Right. Chrome started doing something new with all of that. Move that over. Get this. Okay. So I've downloaded it. Not everyone, I've realized not everyone knows how to open a zip file, which is okay. I'm going to show you guys kind of how to do that right now. You can, if you're on a PC, you just right click and hit extract all. And then you will see this pop up and you just pick where you want it to live. I suggest making this live on your like hard drive, your external hard drive if you get one, or possibly just your desktop because it's just a template folder. And so we'll extract that. And if I open this up, you'll see that it says template folder rename. What you're going to do with this, like if I just throw this to my desktop, where, right here. 99% complete. Give me a break. We all know it's almost done. What is this shenanigans? How is everyone? If you're in the chat, yeah, say hello. Okay, so I have Lena, then Audrey. Do I say her name Nakara? Nakara? Is that how I say it? It's funny. My last name is Makara. People like to say Makara, Makara. It doesn't bother me either way. I'm trying to remember names. All right, Keith's here. What's up, Keith? If I say your name wrong, just shame me in the comments. um, so I moved this over to, okay, cool. Nakara, sweet. I moved this template over to my desktop. And then what I would do is, or possibly even into, this is a great idea, right into my GCC folder. And then I'll put it right, I'll make a copy of it here. Or you could put it right into here. But all you have to do is right click, copy it, go to where you want it, right click, paste it, and then just rename this to whatever project you want it to be. Like for next week, __score bouncing ball. Right? And then when you click into it, you've got a blank template. You can rename that again if you want, or you can just do this too. I can delete it and just copy this one. Control C, Control V, rename that, yada yada. And then what you get is this blank template of empty folders here for you just put all your stuff in. 3D in there is for your Cinema 4D project files. And then PNG sequence renders you can put in there. Your After Effects project you can put into this folder. This is pretty basic. They get much more complex. Mine are very complex because I'm dealing with different stuff and footage throughout my day. And then I have like working files, archived files, and those will be things that you learn to do as you get further into the process and you're doing this for a living. But right now, this is a great spot to start. Like your assets folder, if you open that, I've got images, logos, vector files. You can add to these too, right? So like if for some reason you do have footage, you can right click, go to new folder and just type footage. You know, I believe I have it actually, a footage folder. I do. So I have a footage folder right here. Audio, if you go into this one, I have music, sound effects, voiceover. They're all empty, so they're just there for you guys to place things in. But I figured this is just easy for you guys, right? Just copying and pasting it makes it quick and simple. And then it gets you guys into the habit of like seeing it, understanding this is how it like the organization should be. And this is like an unspoken thing amongst animators, motion, graphic designers, all of us. It's just like there's messy people and there's organized people. So it's just one or the other. But I mean, I like to be on the organized people list because you cause less problems, you know, a little less chaos. So anywho, wanted to give you guys that. I opened my project that we started last week and we're just going to kind of jump into that. Do we have any questions from last week from you guys in the chat right now? Or any questions about like how the class functions, anything you read in the syllabus? All right. I'll read them if I see them coming in. But so we're going to kind of get to animating here. So last time I showed you guys kind of how to set up your file folder over here. We talked about having a composition and placing things onto your timeline down here, right? This is your composition. This whole thing is your composition. Compositing is just adding one or more things together, whether they're images, footage. It doesn't necessarily have to be on top of each other either. It could be placed right next to each other as well, like Putting a sequence of images together is a composition. Putting footage and imagery and effects and stuff together, that's a composition. That all under, sorry, my words, falls under the composition like umbrella, right? Yeah, Nakara said there's a lot to process. And yes, there is a lot to process. That's why I try and give you guys grace with like taking it all in. It can feel like a lot. So it is a lot. But yeah. And then we threw some of these in. We messed around with blend modes down here at the bottom, which was nice. The one thing I forgot to tell you guys is that if you do not see this tab over here, that will be due to this little section right here. You just want to make sure that this one's blue and this one's blue. Inside of After Effects, if there's like little toggles like these, or you'll see when we get to keyframing here, when you see the little stopwatch, those, they change blue, indicates kind of like it's on, whether it's on or off. It's blue is on, gray out is off. And it's not like that for all of them. Like if I push on some of these ones, they won't change color, but like these ones will. It's just an indicator for you guys so that you know. And so if you don't see that kind of stuff, if yours kind of looks like this, you just want to come down here at the bottom and click that little area to unfurl that and bring that out. All right, I'm going to close that real quick. So we have here an image of the sky, the bird, and what I made, the sun, which is kind of like an odd sun, right? I can change it back to yellow, but I think this is pretty neat looking. The sun, I renamed that layer. I showed you guys kind of the naming convention that I did while setting this up, and then setting up like the organization to the files. But I kind of want to rename these as well, just so that I can initially tell which ones are which. I know it says kind of cloud visuals and Amazonian, whatever, but I'm just going to change the name down here in my timeline, and it's just for organizational purposes. So this one I'm just going to type bird, and this one I am just going to type sky. Easier to read, cleaner looking, but it doesn't change up here. If you go into your images, it doesn't change the root name of the folder. It's just changing it down here on your timeline for personal purposes. And each of these items within the timeline, whether it's your shape or your images, have certain properties. So if I take this layer, the sun layer, and I unfurl this, you're going to see a contents and a transform folder. Now this contents folder, let me zoom in here. This contents folder holds all the actual items like shapes or masks or things like that are going to be held within the contents folder. Your transform properties are pretty much primarily what you're going to animate. These are things that you will animate on a daily basis. Now, when I unfurl this contents folder, you see it just shows my ellipse there. The bird's going to be a little bit different. It doesn't have that contents folder because it's not a native layer inside of After Effects. This sun was something that I created inside After Effects, so I have a little bit more wiggle room on how to edit it, where this image is something that I imported into After Effects, which kind of gives me a little bit of limitations. But I still do have that transform folder. And so let's say that we wanted to make this bird fly from one side of the screen to the other side of the screen, right? The one thing I would do is I would unfurl my transform properties here. And you're going to see that I have several going on. There's a few different ones. Anchor point is something that you really won't necessarily in the beginning are going to be animating. We won't do that in this class. That's kind of a higher level. Once you understand the basics of animation, that's more of like a higher level input to start playing around with and animating. But we will use position scale, rotation, and opacity constantly throughout the semester. In fact, these ones, those 4 are your main 4. I would say trifecta, but that would make no sense, right? Because it's 4. Just, I make stupid jokes. I just don't, I find myself entertaining. So I apologize if it's rough for you guys to watch. Anyways, let me zoom back in. I'm sorry about that. I'm trying to get used to this like zooming program, which allows me to annotate on the screen. But position here is the indication of where something is in space within your composition. The scale is how big or small that is. So you can change the scale. If you want it to be smaller, drop it down, higher, bring it up. Scale is in percentage over here. There is a little chain down next to the scale, which indicates that you can unlock the proportions and scale them at different proportions. I don't recommend doing that right away. Once we get a little further in the class, you actually next week we'll do that with the bouncing ball. We will unscale, or we will uncheck the linked proportions, and we'll be doing that separately. But in general, like text, anything that is meant to be not scaled unproportionally, essentially images and like text, right? You don't want to skew the image. You want to make sure that it's always constrained there when you're changing that. Rotation, that's an obvious one. Opacity is how transparent or opaque something is. So if I take this bird and I want it to be, right now it's at 100% opacity, so it's fully opaque, but as soon as I drop that down, it is going to become transparent. So you can fade things onto screen, fade things off screen, etc. These are accessible by, you can unfurl them, but there are keyboard shortcuts that you can use to access these as well. You can hit P for position, S for scale, R for rotation, and opacity is a little weird. You would think it's O, but it's not. It's T for transparency. And so, again, that's PSRT. PSRT. Those are important ones for you to remember. Now you can bring up multiple transform properties at the same time if you hold down Shift. So if I wanted opacity and position, I already have opacity pulled up. I would just hit Shift P to bring up position. If I hit Shift R, it will bring up rotation as well. So, and then Shift S would bring scale up. And so that's how you can kind of bring those up. You want to get used to using keyboard shortcuts because it makes you quicker at what you're doing. And in this job, efficiency is key. The faster you are, the more likely you're going to snag a job. You're going to just, it's going to be better for everyone in the long run if you're just quicker at what you do. You'll get used to this as you go on very quickly. Now, there are these tiny little stopwatches next to these transform properties. And when I click on one of these stopwatches, not right now, but once I do the demonstration, you're going to see it turn blue. This stopwatch is kind of recording any change that you're making. So when it's blue, it means it's on, like I was mentioning before. And when it's grayed out like this, it means that it's off. You only have to press it once you're animating a property. So let's say I wanted this bird, like I said, to fly from off screen, off of our composition. I would bring that over to the first starting position. I would take what is called my scrubber. This is like a scrubbing tool, and I'm going to bring that to the front, and I'm going to hit the little stopwatch here, and notice that that turns blue. And then not only does that turn blue, but that drops this little diamond shape onto our timeline. This little diamond shape is like your little recorded mark that holds those properties of those different it holds the values of those transform properties. And so right now it's holding that value of the position property that my bird is off screen. And so then I'm going to move my, it's also called a playhead scrubber. You'll hear me call it scrubber, playhead. Playhead's a technical term for it, but you'll hear people just say scrubbing through the timeline. This is scrubbing through the timeline. When you grab this blue playhead and you just move it back and forth, clicking and dragging. So I'm going to move that further down my timeline, and then I'm going to change the value of the position property of this bird. And so I'm going to click here, and I'm going to drag that off screen onto the other side. Notice there's this little bar that shows up. This little bar is indicating all of the in-betweens that happen. We'll talk about those later. But then, if I scrub back to the beginning, and then I hit space bar for play, all of a sudden, I have a very simple, very basic animation here of the bird flying from one screen to another. Is this realistic? Absolutely not. I mean, you would see a bird not only moving in X and Y space, but also your X space, but also in your Y space. And you would also see like it would be moving up and down. A big part of animation is observing how things move. And so I just kind of want to get that into your guys' head to start looking at how objects move, how weight affects things, and the way that they move throughout, you know, their path of motion. So I want you guys to kind of start training your eye to see these things. And so we all know a bird would not fly in a straight line like that. It's not realistic. But for this purpose, just to show you kind of basic animation, 2 keyframes, one in the beginning here off screen, one at the end off screen on the opposite side, and we have all of these in between images being created automatically for you with the program. That's kind of the power of After Effects here, is that it all computes that information for you without you having to do it yourself manually like you would do in hand-drawn animation. This kind of just takes the information from the one keyframe to the next keyframe, and all of that space in between, it mathematically does all of the rest for you, which is, I mean, it's a very powerful thing, and it cuts down time immensely. But this is the most basic form of animation here in After Effects. Let's say I wanted to add a little bit of rotation in there. Let's say I wanted him to kind of fully rotate. I would, at the beginning, my playhead, move it to the front. I just keyframed 0 rotation here. And then I would move that over, my playhead over to 1 second. And I'm just going to type 1 in that beginning value, and it's going to give it a full rotation. And so as if I play it, now you have a bird both flying. Really, it looks like it's just getting chucked from one side of the earth to the other, rotating along the way. So very basic form. This is not something that's going to be acceptable for you guys to turn in, but I just kind of want you guys to start playing around in After Effects and understanding how motion happens. Now, can you control the speed of the bird? Yes, you can control the speed of the bird. In fact, this is my next thing that we're going to talk about, and that's time. And so, essentially, your time, how far apart these keyframes are on your timeline, will indicate how fast it is moving. So let's just kind of get into the basics of like what the timeline is. In fact, I'm going to, let me see here. I'll make myself small. I don't know. I have a little cat whose little hands are under the door right now, and just very distracting. Little tiny hands. Cat hands. Okay. I don't want you guys to be paying attention to me, more or less what's on the screen. And so we'll get into how to make things go faster or slower here in just a second. But everything in animation it's all based in time and timing. This down here, like I keep calling it the timeline, this shows time measurements that you're actually working in right now. So if you look across here, you are going to see a series of like numbers with letters. And these you can change them. But the beginning of the timeline is always going to start at 0. And that's your 0 frame. Now over here, off to the edge, we have our time code. And our time code indicates kind of where we are, where that playhead is on the timeline, based on hours, minutes. I'm sorry, yeah, hours, minutes, seconds, and then frame. Okay? Hours, minutes, seconds, frame. Let me write that down for you guys. So it goes hours, minutes, seconds, frames. Now watch this. I want you guys to pay attention to this number as I take this playhead and kind of scrub through my timeline. Right now my playhead's at the beginning of my timeline, and so it's at 0. Everything's at 0 here. But as soon as I take this playhead and I start to scrub through my timeline, you can see that those numbers are changing. So if I stop right here, on my time code, it says that I am at 12, what? Does anyone remember what those were? These are frames. And so this is basically, frames are, yes, correct. Lena said it. Yeah, Keith said it. Awesome. So I want you, frames are huge. This is what we're going to be working in. You're going to hear me say frames per second. Frames are essentially the smallest measurement of time in animation. We can adjust those frames, how many frames are within a second. But in general, we animate at 24 frames a second. Frames you can also think of as images, right? So if I start here, that's 1 frame. If I move ahead 1 frame at a time on my timeline, the image is still there always. The image values, those properties, are what are changing on each frame. And so that is essentially what like frame by frame animation is, right? So each frame, it's just moving a little bit, changing those properties, changing those values as it goes further on the timeline. So you see that there's the 4F, 8F, 12F. Those are the frame count. And then once you get up to here, you notice that it says 1. And that's your second. It says 1.00F. That's 1 second, 0 frames. If you look on your time code over here, you see that it's at 1 second. If I start to scrub further beyond that second, you're going to see that that time code starts to add each frame onto it. So if I ever said, well, I need you guys to go to 2 seconds and 8 frames, you would just take this playhead and you would scrub it over to 2 seconds, 2 seconds here, 8 frames up here. Normally, now this timeline is very open. And what I mean by open is you can see kind of microscopically your frames easier right off the bat. But if I take this there's this tiny little bar down here. And this is essentially zooming in and out of your timeline to show either the broad amount of time that you have, right? If you have 30 seconds of time on your timeline, that's way too many little separate frames. If you think there's 24 frames in 1 second and you have 30 seconds, that's way too many frames to show in this small section here on your timeline. And so you can zoom into that, right? And so right now I have only, this is, if you look at my timeline, I'll ask this question for you guys. How many seconds is my timeline currently? If I have 3 here and 12 here. I want you guys to answer that for me in the chat. And while you're doing that, because I know it's delayed. So I know you guys have to have a second to get to like hear what I'm saying. The streams are always delayed. But if I go down here and I grab this little ball next to here, I can zoom into that timeline. And when I zoom in really, really tight, I can see each microscopic little frame that's in there. Yeah, 3 seconds. Technically, it's 3.5 seconds because there's an additional 12 frames at the end. So if I bring this back out here, we got 3 seconds, 12 frames, which is essentially 3.5 seconds since there's 24 frames in each second. Is this a little confusing to you guys? I know it seems like a lot right now, but I feel like you guys are grasping it. And so if I needed to, if I was like, I really want you guys to be on like 1 second, 6 frames, and you don't see it here, you can either move that playhead and then just kind of pay attention to your time code here off to the left. Or what you can do is you can hit the plus button on your keyboard or the minus button. If you want to zoom in plus, minus is to zoom out. And you can see those more minuscule or microscopic like measurements of time in there for you. And then you can just bring this playhead in and out. Now, when I zoom in the furthest I can go, notice that this playhead just snaps to each number, right? That is because you can't have anything in between a one frame to the other. There is no in between those frames. It just is either on that frame or the next frame. It's like looking at one page, flipping it over, looking at the other page, or like an on-off switch, right? It's either there or it's not. So when I drag this position keyframe out, it's going to snap to each one of these keyframes, and it's not really going to go in between. I'm sorry, it's going to snap to each one of these frames, and it's not going to go in between the frames. I have Keith's question first is, so would you say 12 frames a second is the standard? 12 frames a second is the standard for hand-drawn animation. 24 frames a second is standard for animation in like these programs. The reason being is that 12 frames, if you're drawing, let's say you're drawing an animation, a hand-drawn animation that's 5 seconds long, you would rather want 12 frames in 1 second than having to draw 24 frames, because you have to think like each one's an image, right? So if you're drawing 24 frames in 1 second, that's 24 times 5. How many? I'm terrible at math. 120 frames. That you're 120 different images that you're drawing, hand drawing, if you're animating a 5 second hand drawn thing. And so that's why traditional animators choose to do this that's why originally it was always 12 frames a second, because 12 drawings is I think 10 is the lowest amount that you can have, that when you flip through it, like think of a old school flip, like an animation flip book, like when you're flipping through it, you have to see at least 10 images per second in order to register it as movement. Any less than that, and it's not, at that point, it doesn't register in your brain as something moving across like a screen or a page. It just looks like separate stagnant pictures, or like, just kind of stop, go, stop, go. So if I were hand drawing something that were 12 frames a second, 12 times 5 is 60. So I'd end up drawing half of that, right? yes, it would look very choppy. It wouldn't register to you as like motion, right? How do you calculate the frames to seconds again? I guess we are kind of talking about that right now. Elena, is this kind of making sense to you? Now, when we do, let me see. I'm going to talk a little bit more about frames a second in a moment. But well, let me say this. 12 frames a second, 24 frames a second. You're going to hear people working 30 frames a second and 60 frames a second. Those are kind of most common, what you see in the video and animation world. As far as animation goes, no one ever animates over 24 frames a second. And that is, if you're hand drawing, you always animate at 12 frames a second. And if you're animating in a program like After Effects or Cinema 4D or Blender or something like that, you're always animating at 24 frames a second. 30 frames a second and 60 frames a second are reserved for film and video. 30 frames a second is what you're going to see on television broadcast and soap operas and live TV, right? And 60 frames a second is for like fast moving things, for instance, video games, when you want the motion to be really smooth and you don't want it to be blurry or choppy or anything like that. You do 60 frames a second. So that's reserved for like video games, sports. I don't know if sports broadcasting does 60 frames a second or not, but it's like shooting an action. It's like being a photographer at a sports event and you want to shoot at a really high shutter speed so that it's a very quick image. I'm so sorry. I have something in my eye. I'm going to shut my camera off real quick. Anyways, so I'm going to continue talking while I try and get this out. And so in animation, if you're working inside of any digital program like After Effects or Cinema 4D or any other animation program that creates your in-betweens, right? All of the frames in between your main keyframes. So all of this imagery that's happened, these are your in-betweens. These little dots right here are your in-betweens. And these over, cancel that. Over here, main keyframe. It's just kind of visualizing it. So I only put 2 keyframes down on my timeline, but I all of a sudden have 24 different images of it because the computer is generating those for me based on what my values of my keyframes are. Let me kind of retract my brain real quick. If you were still some programs, right, that you work in digitally, like Adobe Animate, or Procreate, if you're doing like the animation inside of Procreate, you're still gonna want to work at 12 frames a second. 12 is 24 is divisible by 12, and so if you're combining animation that or automatically creates your in-betweens like After Effects, and a hand-drawn animation, if you're combining those two together, you can always combine them together if you're working with 12 frames inside of After Effects and 24. Let me restate that. If you're working at 24 frames per second inside of After Effects and drawing something at 12 frames a second inside of Adobe Animate. We'll kind of work more on this next week when we do the ball project, and you guys will kind of get a better grasp of what that means and how to do that. But I do want you to remember frames per second. How many frames are in each second, right? Right now we have 24. Hand-drawn would have only 12. And so this timeline would look different based on whatever we set that to. And so that's kind of what I'm going to get into now, is like the settings and how you change this. Now, Lena asked how I would make this move faster, right? Because I play it right now, and I mean, I think it's rather fast enough, but like, let's say we did want to make it go faster. I would have to take, it's based on time, right? So the value that is moving this way, let me see here. Is it this one? So time is moving this way on our timeline, right? And the value is changing at the same time. Ooh, how do I want to say this? What I would have to do is I would have to take these keyframes and I would shorten the time in between the first keyframe that I made and the last keyframe that I made. I want to tighten that time up and make it faster, right? So if I take these two keyframes, which are the end ones there, and I move them further to the left, that's going to make this animation faster because there's less frames that it's going across, that it's less like in-betweens and less time that it's taking to get from one position to the other. So now if I play it, it's much faster. Let's say if I wanted to slow this down from the 1 second, I would take these keyframes, these end ones, and I would bring them out. So let's say I wanted it twice as slow. And so then I would go to the beginning of my timeline. I would hit space bar to play, and notice how it's very slow. So how you either increase the time, or I'm sorry, decrease the time or increase the time will affect how fast the animation is happening. And these can be different. These don't have to stay locked to each other, right? I can kind of move these around. This is called offsetting, and we'll do this later. And this kind of looks actually more appealing because things don't move the same way at the same time. Like if you're waving your hand around, the movement of your elbow doesn't match up to the rotation of your hand. If you flap your hand kind of is delayed when it rotates. And so it's a little too fast kind of for that. Let me just move these out. A couple more. And it just kind of gives like a delayed rotation to this movement. So it's not rotating exactly when it's moving across the screen. We'll get into that more. That's a little complex for right now though. So let's reset this guy. 0. I'm going to go in here. And here's another thing you can do. If you guys don't want to, just grabbing on here and moving it is actually bad practice. I know I shouldn't do that all the time. Sometimes I do when it's like a large image like that. But when you start to work with smaller things or you have a lot of images in your composition, it's better to actually come down here to your value and, oh man, I keep hitting that. It's because I can't see right there. I had to move my mic. So you can move these values individually. Either by, there's like a little hand with an arrow, you can grab that and just kind of move back and forth or up or down, and it'll change your position. Or you can click on here and put a position in manually. So I can put, like, if I wanted it 900 in my composition. These values are all based on the composition position. This is really going to be weird, but 0, 0, think of this as like a graph quadrant. It's not an entire graph. So if I were to draw kind of like what you would think, oh, let me do this. What you would think a graph looks like, right? Just a standard, there's a name for them. And you have your different coordinates and whatnot, and 0, 0 is always in the center right here. This whole composition, this whole section, oop, wrong. This whole thing right here, why do we keep doing that? This whole area actually is not this entire graph, so you wouldn't think that 0, 0 starts in the center here. This whole composition actually is this quadrant right here. Let me redo that. This quadrant right here. And so if you were to break this apart, 0, 0 would end up being right up here in the corner. And we're working in right now full HD, which is full HD is always 1920 by 1080. And that's how many pixels are on your screen. And so if you think of this in relation to the graph, right? This is this bottom quadrant here. And this is 0, 0. This direction, this way, would be 1920. And this direction, up and down, would be the 1080. And so the center of your composition is actually half of each of these. And so if I wanted to put this bird centered, I would just half of 1920. You can even do it like this if you're not good at math. It's 960. But if you didn't know that, you could put 1920 divided by 1080, or I'm sorry, divided by 2. And it does the math for you. And so this is your y value, x value, y value. Let me do this. X value, y value, right? 0, 0 up here. 960 by, we'll just take 1080 and divide it by 2, and it's 540. And so that is the actual center of your composition. You get used to this once you start like putting things together and working with it more. But we always work. One thing we always do is we in this class you will always work at 24 frames per second FPS, and your resolution is always going to be 1920 by 1080, which is full HD, right? So like standard televisions and stuff like that. We'll kind of get into that more here in just a second. How do we make sure that those are, that your composition are those values, right? This has to do with your composition settings. Real quick, let me see here. So if you're making a slow-mo speed, these pins, your move creates that. Slow motion is a little different, but yes, like if you wanted slow motion to happen on here, you would just increase the time that the animation is happening over, right? So like if I keyframed at the beginning, right? Bring my playhead at the beginning, I push that little stopwatch there, and it put a little keyframe on my timeline. And then I move my playhead forward, and then I changed the value over here I changed my X value. And if I play this right now, it's really slower motion. But then if I move this last keyframe inwards to the left and then play it, it's faster because the value change is happening over a shorter period of time versus happening over a longer period of time. I hope that makes sense. But let's say we wanted to check to make sure that the frame rate and everything is correct. Those are your composition settings. And the way you access your composition settings are a couple different ways. You can go up here at the top and it says composition, and you'll just click on that section and you can hit composition settings. Notice though how, oh, come on. Oh, it won't do it with this. But when you unfurl those menus, you'll see a bunch of keyboard shortcuts here. And so that helps you, you know, learn those keyboard shortcuts as you go. And we want to get into the composition settings. I'm sorry, we want to, so Control K will get you into the composition settings if you already have a composition made, but Control N will create a new composition for you. Since we already have one made here, I'm just going to click down on my timeline and hit Control K, and it brings up my composition settings here. Here, you can do a lot of things. You can change the name of your composition. So let's say this wasn't the main one, but I just wanted it to say bird composition. I could type in here bird, right? Doing this with mouse, it's not going to be pretty. Notice down here I have, can I erase that? Huh, what's happening? Are you stuck? I think it's frozen. Come on now. Sorry guys, technical malfunction. Let me close. I'm still here. I just have to bring up my task manager. Sorry about that. Just sometimes that notation thing can get a little wonky and go crazy. Anyways, here is an area where you can change your composition name. You can change your how like your definition of it, right? So or your resolution. And I told you guys we are always going to be working in the 1920 by 1080. But if you wanted to change that, let's say you wanted it square for Instagram, right? You could put 1920 by 1920 here. You can also lock aspect ratios, which we'll talk about here in a second. Changing your frame rate. There is a drop down here, but I just prefer to manually type that in. You will always be working in 24 frames a second every single time here in all of your videos, and so I would just leave it at this and not really change it. And then here is your timeline. Here's the duration of your timeline. I don't ever work with this start time code. I only ever change this. So let's say if I wanted this to be, remember the time code is hours, minutes, seconds, and frames. Let's say that I wanted it, gosh, I'm just going to stop using that. I'll just use the zoom. Let's say I wanted this to be 10 seconds. I just go in here and write 10, and then I could put 0, 0 because I just want it 10 seconds flat. And then I could hit OK. And then all of a sudden, if you notice down here, it doesn't look like anything changed, but it did. If you look down at the bottom, this little guy looks like he's zoomed in really tight in that timeline. So if I bring that back, you're going to notice that all of a sudden I have all of this extra time on here. Now, oh no, where did my image go, right? You're like, you've extended your timeline, and all of a sudden you go past here, past the time that you initially had, and there's nothing there, right? You have to extend your layers. If you're shortening your timeline, you don't have to worry about that. But if you're extending your timeline, you have to extend these layers. And so I'm just going to shift click all of the layers and then hold this little arrow key down here and drag that off to the side. And now I still have my images. The bird's not going to show up because the bird is animated over here. Let's see here. Will the default settings always have 24 FPS and 1920 1080, or will we have to manually change those? So if you bring in footage into here, sometimes it will default to whatever the footage is shot at. A lot of times when you bring in footage, it will, I hit Control K again. If I drop this down, it'll be in 23.976, which is just, I mean, it might as well be 24 frames a second at that point, or it'll be at 29.97 or 59. Like, for some reason, cameras, when you're filming, don't ever film at an even number. It's always like a decimal There's always a decimal at it. And so sometimes it might default to different ones. So you always want to check this. But in general, you'll be able to tell because down here as well on your time code, it tells you what frame rate you're working in. It doesn't tell you your resolution, so you will have to check your resolution here. You can also look at the presets. They have presets here. Don't ever do, so 25 frames a second is something they do in Europe. It's not something we do over here. It has to do with the way their televisions are made, I believe, and so you'll never use that. I mean, like, unless very specifically instructed to, but I've never in my career been asked to do that. And so if you ever just want to quickly, oops, go back here. If you ever want to quickly just do that and make sure it's correct, you just click the preset HD. We're in full HD now. 1920, 1080, we're good. But it's always important to know which frame rate you're working at. So it's something that you want to look into. And then, like I said, the duration is how long you want that. I'm just checking my notes to make sure I don't miss anything for you. Yeah. Don't ever worry about here. The pixel aspect ratio, you'll always just be working in square pixels. So you'll never want to change that. And so your settings for all of your animations should always be the following. I'll just write it down for you guys, something for your notes. It'll always be 24 frames per second. It will always be 1920 by 1080 as far as your resolution. And your time will change, right? The time can always change, but usually you're only going to do roughly around like 5 to 10 second animations. You're going to see how long it takes to animate something, and then I think you guys are going to have a great appreciation for how long movies take, because we're working in seconds here and movies are hours long. So and just don't change that pixel aspect ratio. Let me look here. Okay, so let me do this. Let me do another example of something. I'm going to kind of hide these layers right now. Over on the side, you're going to see an eyeball. If I click off of those, it hides your layers. It doesn't mean they're not there, but if these are unchecked when you go to render, it will not show up in your composition. So just something to keep in mind. So I'm just hiding it for a second so that I can't see it. The one thing I did want to go back for a second and mention to you guys is that, oh, what was it? It was about your composition settings. I thought I had it. It's on the tip of my mind, so it might come back to me in a little bit, but I kind of want you guys to understand more or less how the graph kind of works for this, like where your coordinates are. So I'm just going to come up here to my toolbar. I'm going to hold down and click, and I'm going to select the ellipse tool. I'm going to draw a circle, and I'm going to add a fill. So I want it to be a solid circle. And let's remove that stroke right here. And these little areas right here are your layer colors. You can change those if you're having a hard time seeing your, like for instance, you see all these these are your like bounding box of your shape or your image. And you kind of want to see those to be able to work with it. And so sometimes if it's hard to see those, I will just come over here and just change the layer color. And it makes it a little bit easier to recognize that and see them. And so I drew that shape. I'm going to hit V to go back to my selection tool. V as in Victor. And this little thing here is called an anchor point. This anchor point can change. Now, I usually want this to be centered, but in some instances, I want it to be in different areas. Now, if I want to change where that anchor point is, I'm going to go up here to my pan behind tool, or anchor point tool as they call it. Looks like this guy right here. You can also hit Y on your keyboard and it will bring that up. And if I select that, you're going to see this little pan behind tool image by the arrow. And if I grab this little thing in the center, it will move it around, right? And I can move this anywhere. I can move it off screen. I can move it to the top of it here, to the side. It doesn't matter, right? It defaulted to the center for me. It might not do that for you. You guys have a, it depends on your settings, which I can show you later how to do. But wherever this anchor point is going to be the place where the animation originates from on your shape or your layer, right? So if I move this, if I leave it here in the center, let me just center that, kind of get it close. And then the best way to show this is with scale. I hit S on my keyboard to bring up the scale. And I start bringing this up and down. I start changing the value. It is scaling from the center of the object, right? But if I hit Y and I move this down here to the bottom of the circle, and then I start to scale it, you're going to notice that it's scaling from the bottom of the image and not the center anymore. So where that anchor point is matters very much on your layer. And it's going to matter. You're going to get used to this. You're going to start to do things and realize you have to move your anchor point and change your anchor point. This is probably the first thing that you're going to want to do when you create shapes or bring in layers. So for instance, like this bird, not the sun, but the bird. If I brought this back here, if I hit V and brought this bird back in here, and I hide my circle, I would probably actually want the anchor point to be from where the motion of the bird mostly happens. Like where on that bird physically is the motion driven from. And it's actually the body, not the wings, but the body is really the main area. And so I would take my pan behind tool or anchor point tool, probably move it to somewhere right here, right around there. And that way if I scaled that bird, you know, it would scale from that area and not necessarily the center. This one's not that big of a deal because it's an image, but you guys are going to want to start to always remember, like once you draw something or bring something in, anchor point first. That's the key. Anchor point first always. And it'll just help you out. Now I've got this circle here. I'm going to rename my layer for best practices, circle. And I just kind of want to show you guys, remember the center of the composition was 960, which is half of 1920, and 540, right? So that's the center of the composition. If I wanted it to be in the, let's say up here at the far left top corner, that again is going to be 0, 0. Remember, think of the graph that we did, right? So if I want it to be over here on the far right top, does anyone know what that value would have to be? If this is, if going this way is 1920, 1920 pixels, and then going down is 1080 pixels, and here is 0, 0. 0, 0. So what value would I have to type in to my position in order for it to be in this upper right hand corner? I'll give you guys a second. It's kind of tricky, but when you can start thinking about this, you'll understand the space that you're working in. In the meantime, while you guys are answering that, I'm going to make a couple more balls here too. Yeah. So the question is, what would the value be of the position of this circle right here? What would the X and Y value be? Yes, it is like the X and... So Lena said it's the X and Y values in math. The coordinates, correct. That is correct. Here is your... this value over here is your X. This one over here is your Y. This is this coordinate up in the very top corner where it is now is 0, 0. And so if going across your X coordinate is 1,920 pixels and going down your Y coordinate is 1,080 pixels, what would this coordinate have to be in order to bring this circle from this top left corner to the top right corner? I can give you guys the answer. But if you think right now, because we're on, you're not changing an X value, right? You're not trying to go, I'm sorry, you're not changing your Y value because you're not going up or down, right? But you're going, you're moving on your X values. So what would this X value have to be if this is 0, 0 and the max of your X is 1980? Or I'm sorry, 1920, blah, blah, blah. Let me write this here. Sorry, guys. Words are hard for me today. A little funny. So, lots of numbers. 1080. It would have to be, right? Because we're not changing Y value here. We're only changing the X value. So, in that case, your X value right down here would have to be 1920. And it moves it, and you don't even have to change the Y because that's your furthest tippy point, right? If this is 0, 0, this one's 1920. If this is 0, 0, this bottom part is 1080. Yes, correct. Yeah, Keith got it right. Yeah. Down here, though, it's your X is on this side. X is right here. Y is right here. So it's like this, XY. Yep, perfect. So then if I had to get down to this bottom, the bottom right corner, what would I have to put in? I just kind of want you guys to understand more or less like how the space works in here. Oh, I didn't want to do that. Cancel that and make a new one. If I wanted to bring this main circle down to the very bottom right-hand corner, what would my values have to be? Yes, correct. Yes. Keith is right. So it would have to be, let me just hide this one that I just made. 1920 by 10, if I put 1080 in the Y value, it's going to drop right down to the bottom. And so that's kind of how, like if I wanted to bring this over to this corner right here, right? So this would be 0 because we're not, oh, let me uncheck that. I would just type in 0 because we're not moving anywhere on the X value. We're only moving down on the Y value. And so that's why if I want it in the center, it's half of each one. So if here's a great way, 0, 0, I can just animate that for you guys. And I keyframe the position at the beginning of my timeline, bring my playhead to the beginning, keyframe it as 0, 0, and then I move this to, I'll do a minute 12 frames. And I did 1920 by 1080. How do you guys think this is going to move? diagonally. So then if I play this, it animates across the corner of the screen like that. It's just going to help you guys just to know how the coordinates kind of work on here, so that way you're going to understand your values a little bit more. And so I'm going to actually, let's scale this circle down. Let's do 100. Actually, let's do half of that because we need to put 3 of them on here. 50. I'm going to hit V. I'm going to duplicate the circle. Now, I could draw another one, but it'd be just easier because I want them all the same size. And so I'm going to hit Control D as in dog, or Command D if you're on a Mac. And you're going to notice that it duplicates the layer down here, but it doesn't look like there's an extra one, an extra circle anywhere. That's just because it is hanging out on top. So I'm going to drop that down. I'm going to duplicate the second circle and then bring that one down here. So we have 3 circles. Kind of spread those out a little more evenly. Let's change the color of that second one to a lighter blue. And then this one we'll do to an even lighter blue. Alright, that looks cool. Let's put a background on here so that you guys aren't looking at this on a transparent area. In order to do a background, you just come down here to your timeline and you right click and you go to New, Solid. And that's just going to create a whole solid layer back here. And it'll automatically default to whatever size your composition is. And then you can just come down here and change the color of that, which I'll put like a deep dark blue. And then it automatically brings that to the top of your layer list, right? And remember, layer order matters. So I'm going to drag that down to the bottom. And so we have 3 circles here, 3 balls, and a background. And I'm going to add some text here so you guys kind of know which one is going to be which. I'm going to do this at 30 FPS. Let's make this a little smaller. I'll show you guys how to do this stuff later, but for right now, I'm just going to put that there. And this is just going to be a visual for you guys to kind of be able to see how the frames per second looks differently. Compared to each other. And I'm going to make this one a darker color since... Okay. Okay. I didn't delete them. I just hid the layers out of my view so I can see. Now, we are going to animate all of these balls. So we're going to select all 3 of them and we're going to hit P for position. And we're going to keyframe those initial positions. Notice that I can do this like kind of mass keyframe things and record their properties all at once, which is nice because it, if you're planning on doing the same thing to multiple objects, you can just kind of do it en masse and then adjust the keyframes later, right? And so let's say I want to do that. And then I'm going to bring this to, let's move these to this side here. I'm going to put that on an even right over here. So now if I just play this, they all move the same. We're working at 24 frames a second right now. And so this is what just kind of 24 frames a second looks like. But let's compare these together. So what I'm going to do is add an effect on here called posterize time. And what this effect does is it essentially just changes the the frame rate of the layer that it is on. So it's not changing. Notice that I add that on. It's not going to change the frame rate of your composition, just the frame rate of whatever layer it's on. So I went to posterize time and I'm going to type 12 in here because I want this one to be 12 frames a second. And then I'm going to actually take this effect, highlight it there, and hit Control C to copy it. And then up on this top circle, I'm going to go back into this effects and I'm going to hit Control V and it's going to paste it there. I just have to change the frame rate to 30 frames a second. So this will be, oh no, hi little one. I've got a little kitty here with me. If I play this now, you're going to see how they look different. Let me just do this real quick. I hear you, little one. Notice how choppy. And it's funny, the higher frame rates that you get up at the top here with 30 frames a second, you would think it would look smoother, but it just doesn't really work that way. It just, for some reason, our eyes perceive the smoothness at 24 frames a second. It's like the sweet spot, right? And so that's why we want to be animating at 24 frames a second. The 12 frames a second is enough to make us visualize and see the motion, but it's still kind of choppy there, right? If I add a little bit of motion blur, it might make it a little less, a little more bearable, but not really. It still kind of looks choppy as this plays. But the one that looks the nice and smoothest is the 24 frames a second. The timing's not different. They're all starting at the same location and ending at the same location, right? They're all being animated over the same amount of time. Just however many different frames are in between really does affect the way that the animation looks. And so I could just kind of want you guys to visualize how each frame rate works so that you can understand why we work at the 24 frames a second and not at 30 or not generally at the 12. When we do a little hand-drawn animation, we will work at 12 frames a second because nobody wants to draw 24 frames, right? But 24 frames is the smoothest and ideal quality that we're after. So the reason that hand-drawn frames look smoother at 12 frames a second is something called, let me bring this over for you guys, smears, animation smears. And so what animators do is they distort and change the image to look like it's smearing across time, which makes it look smoother. And the more they smear it, the more it looks smooth. So here's a good one. I don't know which anime that's from. Let's see. Here's a Bugs Bunny. Like Bugs Bunny is shaking his head. It's a way to show motion blur. And so when you draw and distort it like this over a few frames, it's going to look like he's shaking his head really, really fast, right? Or like this guy, like he would be wiggling his arms over and over again really fast because it's just the way our brain perceives it. And so with 12 frames a second, it doesn't really look super choppy to us when they're drawn that way. They account for that when they're illustrating things. Let me see here. And they just, yeah, let me see if they see like this in this GIF or GIF. When he slides from the one screen to the other, you notice his body stretches. I wish I could pause it. Maybe I can. We'll save this to the desktop real quick. Let's see if I can bring it in here. Importing objects, remember, you can hit Control I, or you can right click and select import. That's how you bring your assets in. I'm just going to bring this in. Import it. Let's see if we can break this down frame by frame. So, if I move forward, notice a smear right there. This is really cool thing also about After Effects is you can bring in videos and stuff, and you can scrub through each one frame by frame. See the smear there? It makes it look smoothed out, right? It makes that fast motion look smooth. Smears everywhere. Like almost every other frame, there's some kind of smear happening. This is a great way to learn how to do frame by frame hand-drawn animation. That book that I was telling you guys about on Thursday, the Animation Survival Kit, that one breaks down all of this kind of stuff, right? So like if I'm scrubbing through and the section where he starts to move off screen, look how he stretches out. Now it's going to stretch. He's going to stretch. Look how funny this dude looks. You know, stretches back over and then to a spot. Like that's one frame, that's another frame. That's how quick he gets from one position to the other. Like he's moving fast, right? He's drinking, moving really fast. One to the other. He's there. So I hope that kind of gives you guys more of like a visual breakdown of like how animation smears happen. They're really cool. You get used to like seeing people distort them. But that book, if you guys are really interested in the hand-drawn animation, I really recommend getting that book. But it's like a stylistic choice, right? Actually, animators still will use 12 frames a second. But and it's more of like a stylistic thing that they do. So it's not that you can't use it. We just don't use it in class, but it makes it look a little bit choppier, and it just gives it like this nice stylized look that kind of gives you a nostalgic feeling. But it is, yeah. Lena says that that's really creative. Did the animators hand draw the smears? Yes, they hand draw the smears. Because all of that is hand drawn. So they just have to you have to think about how weight would move. It's very, obviously it's not realistic to that, but you just have to kind of, animation can be what you want it to be. You can defy physics if you want to, but everything good, like they say, a good lie is a mix between the truth and a lie. And I'm not telling you guys how to lie, but that's kind of like a good animation is kind of a mix between what's realistic and what's not realistic. And then you can, once you get comfortable with those parameters, you can really start to stretch those limitations out. And it's very similar to what they say about artists, like traditional artists. They learn from copying the masters at first, and they learn their basics of it. And then once you know all of the principles of drawing and you're good at that, is when you can start changing things, like cartoonists working with proportions of characters and the realism of things. Like once you know realistic stuff, then you can really start to skew things in more of an odd way, and it's just more believable, if that makes any sense. But yeah, let me see, we did the frame rates. Actually, let me do this one at 6. I don't think this one. Here's how you'll see it at 6 frames a second. Let's do 6 FPS. And then let's change this one. This is why you'll see why we don't really kind of go below. I feel like 30 frames a second wasn't fully represented there very well, but let's see. So every second you get 6 of these images. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Here you get 12 images. Here you get 24. So you can really see the smoothness and the difference. And that's why no one really works at 6 frames a second. Because you can clearly see each individual frame. With these, you really can't. This one starts to blur together. This one, obviously, you can't see any of the individual frames. But this one, you really can. So no one works under 12 frames a second. Let me see. I want you guys to put any other questions you have right now in the chat. I'm going to read through my notes real quick and see if there's anything else I want to tell you from the resolution side of it. I do, actually. Yeah, kind of let me get into like the depths of resolution a little bit more for you guys. So resolution, uh, I kept telling you that this resolution of our timeline, if I hit Control K, 1920 by 1080, it's high definition, right? And these are in pixels. So just kind of like a painting or not a painting, but like a picture, are in pixels. So is this. This is in pixels. Now, let me see here. The pixel inside of After Effects, using those properties, is the smallest measurement of the measurement of the where was that? I want to say it's the smallest like measurement of unit in space that we use here on our composition. So everything boils down to visually a pixel. If I zoom in super, super tight here, let me remove the motion blur. If I move in really, really tight, it's actually not, this is a vector shape, which is created based on mathematics and not on pixels. But if I zoom in a lot, this is what like pixelation kind of looks like, right? And then it appears to be like a fuzzy edge when you see things. It's like bringing in a picture. For instance, this bird. This bird is so many pixels. And as soon as I start to go beyond what those pixel amount are, if I hide these, these as well. And then I take this bird and I scale it beyond where it can go to. Notice how it's like super grainy looking. It doesn't look sharp. That's because we're working in pixels. So if you're ever bringing images into After Effects, just be conscious about what the pixel amount is of that image. Like if the image is, like 4,000 by 4,000 pixels and it's like just a squared image, and you bring that in here and you're working in 1920 by 1080 definition, that'll be plenty of pixel amount for you to scale that image up or down as much as you want without really losing definition. But let's say the image, you're working in the 1920 by 1080 resolution, and the image that you bring in is only like 100 pixels by 100 pixels. As soon as you bring that in, that's going to look really pixelated and grainy. How long will the class projects take to make? Well, that just kind of depends on how quickly you start to learn these things, and how fast you end up becoming. It's going to take a while at first. I usually tell students, you're going to probably work at least 10 hours in this class a week, between like creating assets and bringing them in and animating them. We're going to start by smaller things. I'm going to give you guys assets to work with. That way you're not creating all of them from scratch right away. But once we get into our later half of the semester, you're going to be pretty much creating a majority of the stuff on your own. And that will take a lot more time to create. Most of the longest, I think, video we do in here is like maybe a minute. Maybe a minute and a half, and that's usually real at the end. Or sometimes we do these like infographic stuff at the end that we'll go over too. All right. So we've talked about resolution, we've talked about frame rate, a little bit about your timeline down here. Now, last week I mentioned that there were different views of your timeline. Let's go ahead and I'm going to bring these up, hide these. In fact, I'm going to just remove the sun, the bird, and the sky. We're just going to work with the things here. And I am going to... Oh, here's another quick tip for you guys. Here... you know, I was saying you can change your timeline by hitting Control K, the duration of it. Like, let's say I wanted it only at the 2 seconds long. I could put that in here. What you can also do is you can scrub your playhead over to where you want it to stop. You can hit N on your keyboard for Nancy. And it brings this little area, which is your rendering. This is your render area, your work area right here. It brings that down to where your playhead is. And then if you right click here and hit trim comp to work area, it will shorten that timeline. It doesn't work for extending timelines though, just for shortening. Nakara asked for these live streams. Are these just demonstrations and not, what does it say? And no, I can't read that. Why'd they put a heart little emoji thing down there? And next week we'll start. Correct. Yes. I'm like trying to translate that and I had to put the, okay. In the chat box, it just gives, there's something covering what you said. But for these live streams, are we just demonstrations and next week we'll start? Correct. I just kind of want you guys to familiarize yourself with different terminology and different areas within After Effects. And then next week we're going to create some bouncing balls so that you guys get used to it. Because even with the bouncing balls, you guys are going to come into issues. Everyone does the first time. So, but then what will happen is during the live streams, I go through your projects with you, and then you guys essentially have to recreate those projects. And so that's why I think catching the live stream at first is a great idea. And then when taking notes, and then when you go to actually do the project, you can pull those notes out and start working from there, right? And then we don't have to watch this later on. But each project's going to take about a week to do. Not the full week. I mean, you're not working 24 hours on it, but. All right, so good questions, though, you guys. Very active chat, and I'm into it. All right, let's move this playhead back to the timeline. So I'm going to select all of these layers, and if I hit U for umbrella on my keyboard, it brings up all of the properties that are keyframed. So it's just a shortcut to bring up your keyframes in view. So you're going to want to write that one down. A couple shortcuts that I've said today. Let's do a real quick recap. Okay, so there was Control plus K equals comp settings. Spacebar equals play when you're in your timeline. Let's do transform properties are P, you don't have to, like, case doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be uppercase, but P, S, R, and T. To view keyframes on layer, that one equals U. Let's see. Lena asks, is there an ideal average of pixel count to look for? It just kind of depends. We're always going to be working for 1920 by 1080. That's always going to be our resolution. That's the pixel count for the size of our canvas or a composition that we're working in, right? A composition, great way to think of it, is like a canvas, similar to art. Because I know I have a lot of like traditional artists in this class. So your composition is your canvas. We're always going to be working at 1920 by 1080. So that's a good thing to remember for if you ever do source images or create images inside of a pixel-based program like Photoshop or Procreate. You're going to always want to make it bigger than 1920 by 1080. And that will allow you to do things like scaling the objects inside of your illustrations up or down. Good question, though. Let's see. View keyframes on a layer. Actually, I have a great source for you guys on site in your Miro. Let me see if I can access it right now. Are you guys understanding this a little bit more? Just kind of like a lot, right? Is there anything you guys don't understand, which I can explain a little further? Will I look this up? Sweet. Okay, the Miro board, which is on Canvas Home. It will be on there next week. But once I get this up, you guys can... Oops, wrong. Go to here. This is shared for you guys. And I give you guys some shortcuts. So you can click on this After Effects shortcut link here. And it will take you through 30 keyboard. There's a video you guys can watch for shortcuts inside of After Effects. Some different shortcuts when we start working inside of Cinema 4D and then also inside of Illustrator. These will help you guys become faster. So these are just notes I've taken from other classes, some notes on typography once we get to that. But these will help you in the long run. And so you can take these and go through them. I can always add more later. But these are for you guys to work with. And you guys can add these to your own Miro boards as well, if you want to. So just something for you guys to think about. All right, let us move on to Dope Sheet versus Graph Editor. I'm going to just delete the text off of these. In fact, we are just going to work with one circle today. We're going to work with this one. Delete these right now. Or we'll work with the two here. That way you guys can see a difference. Where is the Miro board? It's going to be posted up next week, but I can switch to, let me give this to you guys right now in the chat. One second, let me pull it back up. All right. Here, I'm sending it to you guys in the link, or in the chat. I'm sending the link there. So if you go there, I shared it with you. You guys you won't be able to make changes on this one because these are my notes for you guys, but you can go in there and access the links and like copy. You can probably copy and paste some of the stuff as well. So just let me know if for some reason that doesn't work. And let me bring these down. We'll keep them up here. Notice if I change this, right? Like, here's a great way. A lot of students end up with what I like to call a hitch in their animation, where it looks out of place and it doesn't smoothly go from one spot to another. And that's usually because a student will accidentally change a value midway through their between their keyframes that they don't want. And so that will change the path, right? So all of a sudden, I'm just moving here on my X value for both of these balls. But as soon as I bring in that Y value, check out that path changes that my animation is going around, right? So it starts here, but then it goes up and kind of arcs and then settles down there because I have another keyframe that I added. And so it's like an arcing motion. Let me see if I'm going to hide this one for now, just so it's not a distraction. This one's nice and in the middle. So I can change the path of my animation by just adding keyframes in there and changing those values as well. Like if I bring that down there and then I move halfway. So I'm like, this is 1/4 of a second at 6 frames because we've got 24 frames, right? So 1/2 of a second is 12 frames. 1/4 of a second is 6 frames. And then we'll go to 18 frames and I'll bring that down here. And then I've got a ball that kind of goes up and down like a roller coaster. which is really neat. I want you guys to start like kind of playing around inside of After Effects and getting used to looking at your keyframes on your timeline and seeing just kind of seeing how the motion, playing around with the motion and the different settings and stuff in here and the different transform properties. Now, this view that you're looking at right now with the layers and the little keyframes like here, this is called your dope sheet. This is the dope sheet view. This is, this view is generally the standard view which you start up with inside of After Effects. When you put something on your timeline, this is essentially what you're going to see. The next view I'm going to show you is the graph editor. And this is where you ease your keyframes, which we'll learn about later. But I just want to kind of get this term in your head. If I write KF, it stands for keyframe. Apostrophe S is keyframes, right? Multiple. Let me... Alright, so we're in our dope sheet view right now. Let's move to our graph editor view. I'm going to select this layer. And then I'm going to click this little button right here. And that's going to turn you to your graph editor. When you toggle that on, you'll be in graph editor view. And if you toggle that off, you will go back to dope sheet view. So it's just like an on-off thing, right? On-off. Right now, you don't see anything on there, and that's because I don't have any properties selected for any layers. So I have the layer selected, but not the actual position. But as soon as I grab that position, what you're going to notice is these lines kind of appear, right? And this is like a visualization. This is a graph for you to visualize how the motion is occurring, how, like what the animation is actually doing. So once you get used to animating more, you could look at a graph, at an animation graph, and know what the animation looks like based on what the graph looks like without even seeing what the animation is, right? Those people have eagle eyes, and you can do it. It just takes a lot of work and time. So right now we are in the speed graph, but I want to be in the value graph. And how I get there is I just right click and I go to edit value graph. And you're going to notice the lines, right? There's a red line and a green line. This red line is your X value. If you look at the little area right there, it tells you what is your object that you're looking at, right? We're looking at circle 2. We're looking at the X position change over time. So here's a great way. You're visualizing the value is increasing. The pixel value is increasing over time, right? And then you can see right now, based on where my mouse is, that's the spot, like right here. That circle is at 745, essentially, pixels on the X value, right? You notice that the green line is completely horizontal, and that is because as we move, we're not changing in our Y value. That is our Y value. Notice that the circle position, right? The position Y is 560, but it's going to be 560 the whole way because that's where it is in space. That is where the Y value is in space. If I look here, watch your values right here, your X and your Y. If I scrub through the timeline, the only one changing is the X value, not the Y value. So the Y value is staying put at the 560 pixels, right? But when you click on that position property, and this works for all properties except for your, I believe your transparency won't show up on this, but your scale will, and so will your rotation. The rotation will not show up in an X and Y form. I believe it is just one line unless you're working in 3D. But throughout all our programs, you're going to see in our graphs that you have a red line, a green line, and a blue line. The blue line we don't have here because the blue line is reserved for 3D. But each one of those lines, red is always the X value. Green is always the Y value. and blue is always going to be your Z space value, your Z, right? That's for 3D. Let me do this. That's your third dimension there. So essentially, we can move side to side and up and down, but we can't move backwards and forwards. That backwards and forwards motion is going to be your blue, your Z space, which would be a blue line indicator. We'll see that when we start working in Cinema 4D, and then once we start to do what's called 2.5D inside of After Effects, which is a faux 3D technique, essentially. And so that's kind of like the first things to note here. Now, if I move down to half a second or 12 frames, and I decide I want to change that Y value, I want to bring that up. Notice how the Y value is changing here, but it looks opposite, right? Like I moved that up. Why did this arc move down? Well, that is because of the way that the values work on the graph, right? The graph is opposite values of what your composition or your canvas is. So, oh, I did not want to zoom, but I wanted to use this. So let's do the T up here, 0, 0, right? Up in the corner there. Let me see if I can do this. But down here, this is 0, 0. So it's flipped. Okay, so part of the quadrant, right? The quadrant graph that we were talking about. I actually had it in my notes and I just didn't see it. It is called just do this. The name of this graph, there's an actual name for it. And it is called, let me see if I can find it. Starts with a C. The Cartesian plane, which is a positive and negative, right? Of course it would do this to me too when I did that. Select. If you ever do this, you're like, where'd it go? Just select your property. You'll be okay. Let me do this. 0, 0 on the Cartesian plane. 0, 0. So if I were to draw that Cartesian plane, here's what your composition looks like, is this plane right here. And this one right here is your graph editor up the top. Oh my gosh. Talk about interesting text. But does this make sense to you guys? So if 0, 0 is the center there, and this is where your comp is, the 0, 0 is up here. And if your graph is up on this quadrant, which would technically be the second one, 1, 2, 3, 4. So if it's on the second quadrant of your Cartesian plane, it is the 0, 0 is down here. So then, right, so you have your value, whatever value is changing over time. This never changes. The bottom one is always going to be time because it's your timeline. It's stretching across that timeline. So right now, the X value is going from whatever this one is. Let's see here. If I move this here, my X value is at 382 pixels. And over time, over 1 second, it moves from 382 pixels on the X to 1,535 pixels. And then here, so that's why this kind of looks opposite, right? Because this graph is like a different section of the Cartesian plane. So I am moving, when I move up here, it's actually moving down in value because 0, 0 is up here. It's like the dumbest thing I think After Effects has ever done is doing this and not matching it up with, like these should match. These should match exactly as seen. But because we're moving up, right, and the value goes from 0, 0 to 1080, it's actually moving down in value. So the image moves up, but the value moves down. You'll kind of get used to it more when you start playing in this. It makes sense to me, but you guys are probably like, this is just hurting my brain right now. And it's okay. Hands in the chat if it's hurting your brain. I get it. Throughout this thing, I've been hitting Control S, which is to save. So I want you guys to get used to doing that. That's kind of like all about the graph editor right here. Right? So the value is moving down, but the image is moving up. Ooh, and you've got like a nice cool arc there. Any questions about the graph editor right now? We're generally going to be wanting to use the value graph and not the speed graph. We can eventually get to this one, but in general. Yes, it will. Lena, it will, I promise. You'll be like, okay, I understand it a little more once you get your hands in here and you start working and you start visually seeing based on the changes that you're making. And you'll understand it a little bit more. All right, so let me see here what I want to talk to you guys about. I talked to you guys about importing. Let's talk a little bit about files real quick. So, oops, I did not want to do that. Let me get off of so we're back in our dope sheet view. So if I go back to our project over here, project panel, effects and controls panel, if you're ever like that, you're like, oh, where'd it go? Project panel there. One thing that happens a lot to a lot of students, if I bring in this picture of this bird, scale it down, is some students will accidentally double click on their image or like an asset that they bring to their timeline, and they get to here and they're like, what happened? Where do I go from here? Like all of a sudden everything looks different. I can't really move this around. If I change my values, they're not working on my properties. And that's because you're kind of like in the layer view of the actual image. And you're not in the composition anymore. In order to get out of this layer view, you just come up here and you can close this layer up at the top of your panel. And then sometimes you'll be here and you're like, oh, that's not it. You just go right up here to where it says composition main, and you'll click on that panel and it brings you right back to your composition. That is something a lot of students deal with when they're first working inside of After Effects. And it freaks people out because they're like, where'd all my work go? And you like accidentally have double clicked on something and brought yourself. Like if I double click on this solid, this background here, it brings me here and I'm like, where'd all my stuff go? I can't see it. It's because I just went into that layer essentially. I like, how do I say it? Like soloing that layer and I just click up here back to your main composition. And then remember, if you lose anything, if you close this out on accident, oops, I closed this out. Now I don't have it anywhere. Oh no, it's all gone. You can go up to your window here. And if you scroll down, you can just add your composition main. And then it brings it back. And then if it's really messed up, you just go up to your default and you right click and you say reset to saved layout. And then it's going to reset that for you. Let me see. We were going to talk about importing different kinds of files into here. I think I touched on that last week, but I already told you guys that you can import. So you can import. Let's think here. Let's break this up. So images, which can be JPEG, PNGs, also GIFs or GIFs are images. You can do video. Gosh, learn to type, which is like MP4, MOV. Sometimes if you record your videos inside of OBS, they come out as an MKV. All of these shortcuts are called file extensions, and they're all different types of files. They all mean different things. They're compressed differently, which means they're created differently. For instance, here, a JPEG. Oh, shoot, I lost that. Let me bring up here. Like a JPEG, JPEG or JPG, doesn't matter, versus a PNG. They are very different. A JPEG is a very compressed file. They're usually smaller, and they only possess 3 different types of channels, which is red, green, blue, RGB, versus a PNG, which is it's a larger file, but actually the larger file's the better, right? Because that gives us the larger the file, the more information that is present within that file. And so when we're working with animation, we want the most information that we can have. And those are things like pixel density, color information, bits, all of the types of things that you would see in just a regular image, right? And so the more information in something that we can get, that's what we want to work with. And so if we can work with the PNG, that's what we want. When we're exporting things, we'd want to export them as PNGs versus JPEGs. The other thing that PNGs have, which JPEGs do not, is they have an RGB plus A, which is your alpha channel. And if you remember from last class, an alpha channel is transparency. That is awfully hard to see against that circle. Let me do that. Kind of made my eyes wobble a little bit. But like right here is a fully dark blue background. But as soon as I lift that off and you see these little squares, this translates to a transparency that's on screen. And if you see this, that means there is nothing there. There are no pixels present. As soon as I turn that background on, we have the whole screen. There's pixels present everywhere because it's full, right? It's full of pixels. It's full of color. But if I were to erase some of this, let me see if I can do that. That works. Oh, like if I move this down here, right? And I render this image out, even though it's off to the side, it's going to look like there's a blue section here, but then all of this is going to be black because there's nothing there. So there's no pixel information there, right? So when we're bringing things in, we want to shoot for PNGs, but we'll accept JPEGs if necessary. As far as images, movies, MOV, MP4, MOVs are the native type to Mac computers. So if you export things on a Mac, it's going to export them natively as a .mov. .mp4 is just traditionally done with Windows machines. MKV is also like when you're exporting something out from OBS. But they're all video files and they're all okay to have. The only one that pertains a transparency layer is MOV files. Gosh darn it. Sorry, you guys. I'm not going to redo that. But you can also import other Adobe files into After Effects. So what does that mean? I can import in there, let's see, I can bring in here a Photoshop document. I can bring in here an Illustrator document. I can bring in here a Premiere Pro or an Audition, right? So this would be photos and images. This is images vector. So these are mathematically illustrated versus done with pixels, right? Video, files or like audio files, right? Because Photoshop is pictures, Illustrator's illustrations, Premiere is to make videos and edit, and Audition is for music editing or audio editing. You can bring all of those into After Effects. The cool thing about this, bringing in an Adobe file into another Adobe program, is that it retains all of the information that is in that working file into After Effects. And so, for instance, if I brought in here an Illustrator file, let's say, I'll do this real quick. I'm opening Illustrator. I'm just going to open, we'll bring this in. Cool. Let's see, is it going to work? We'll bring this North America map in. So I've got this North America map, right? I want to find that North America map. I think it is in the GCC folder, 184. Okay, cool. I'm going to copy this and move it into our folder here. Illustrator, perfect. Paste it. And then I'm going to go back into After Effects, and I am going to hit Control I to import. And then I'm going to navigate over to that folder. Over here, Assets, Illustrator. And I'm going to take that, and I'm going to import it as a composition, not as footage. I'll tell you guys why about that later once we start to do that. And then I bring that down into here. You're going to see I all of a sudden have my map. Well, let's say I didn't want that map to be blue anymore. I wanted it to be a different color. These, because I brought in an Illustrator file, they're dynamically linked to each other. So whatever changes that I make inside of another Adobe program, like this Illustrator document, right? If I select all of these, or if I select this and go to select the same fill color, and then I decide to change it to, let's do like a green. Okay, we'll do some of it green, whatever, just for the example. And I save this file, and then I bring it into here, and I save this here. I will go down to the layers, and I'm going to right click, and I'm going to reload the footage, and then it should change the colors for me. Let's see. It should be dynamically linked. Oh, I opened this one from the wrong one. There's a reason. It is because I had the other one open when I should have had this one open. Okay. This is the file. I had the incorrect file selected. This is a file that is in our inside of our After Effects folder right now. So if I wanted to select that and then change the color of the United States to that green, right? And I hit OK, and I save this, and then I move over to here. All of a sudden it links it. So this is a great workflow. You're going to hear me say that word a lot. This is a great workflow to have. Workflow, what is that? It is the way that you work in between your projects. It's the way that you work in between different programs. It's the way that you save things. It's essentially how you work, right? And so best practices workflow is to be able to have something, the option to edit something at any point and make it easier within your workflow to do that, right? And so this is best practice workflow, is bringing in, whenever you can, another another Adobe working file into After Effects. There's a lot of A's. I'm like, tongue twisters left and right. But the more Adobe working files that you bring into After Effects, the more editability that you have within those files and within your project, right? And so remember I said I double click on this and it brings me into here. Well, let me just click off of this layer. And here it is inside of my composition. So that is something that you can also importing things into After Effects. You can do, like I said, movies, the GIFs if I bring this into here, and all of this is a composition, right? The other thing you can see, which is really neat, is if I make this panel, if I take my composition panel and make it shorter, I can see all of the information of anything that I bring into here along the side, right? So I can see on my images how large those images are, right? Let me move this over this way. I can see the name of the image, how large that image is. If it's a video, I can see the frame rate up here. So this is a great way for you guys to check your compositions, right? This North America composition is 24 frames a second. A great way to check videos when you bring in movies into here. How long that composition lasts, you can see that up here. This is essentially all of your information. This right here tells me my pathway to where those images or assets that I brought in are. In this one, again, so this is a great way to kind of work backwards. You're like, oh no, I forgot where I put that. Where did it go? Well, this is my pathway to get to it. Or I'm not sure how big this was. Was this the right size image or not? You can check there. Is my frame, are all of my compositions 24 frames a second? Yada, yada, yada. You can check all of that kind of stuff here too. And then you just put your key in between the two panels and you can either extend that panel or shorten it, whatever you need to do. All right, so for instance, like this right here, great way to show you the difference between a JPEG and a PNG. This is a JPEG, even though it fakes showing that there's like transparency stuff there. It is not transparent. It is a JPEG image. But then as soon as I bring in that bird, right, the bird has an alpha channel, so that's a PNG, right? Because the bird, there's nothing around the bird. If there were white around the bird, it'd be a JPEG. It could be a PNG, but without an alpha channel. But this has an alpha channel. Therefore, it's a PNG. Just remember that this, you have to, keeping best practices of saving your files in the same spot, not moving your files, right? Will help you without losing all of this stuff later. Because any external assets that you have in your project are not saved with the project, right? They're still in the spaces where you put them originally, where their little homes are. So you just have to kind of get that into your mind. If you ever did, let's say you were working and you had images on your desktop and you had images in your downloads folder and all these assets that you're using and they're kind of all over the place on your computer, there is a way to save your file with all of those assets, and it creates a new folder with all of those assets in it, including your project. And that's called saving with dependencies. And so what you would do is you would go up here to File, and you would go down to Dependencies and Collect Files. You have to save your project first. You have to save where you want it. This box usually pops up. And you would usually want to reveal your collected project in your Explorer when finished. And you'll hit Collect. And what that allows you to do is save your project. I'll save it to my desktop. Anywhere that I want on my computer, with all of the assets collected that I've used. So those assets could be all over. It's not a great way to work, right? But it is something that you can get away with in case you do have assets all over the place. And so if I open my desktop folder and I go to that AE test folder here, you're going to notice that there's a little footage folder. And if I open that up, there's assets, Illustrator file. It's got that North America file that I had used. And it's also going to have the images that I've used. And so that's like one way that you can, if you're having trouble or you need to send a file to someone, like a working file, you can just do this and save it and send it on your way. Where would I recommend saving files on the computer? Would it be under desktop, C drive, or documents? I usually, you guys can see here, I like to keep my desktop clean. I'll still put things on my desktop, but I always move them to like a permanent place. And so if I show you guys how mine is, here is kind of like your folders. I have a Dropbox account, which I save things into that way. But I usually don't save projects necessarily on my PC directly. If I were going to do that, I would probably save it into a documents folder that I labeled GCC. But if I have an external hard drive hooked up, like I do right here, this is a big external hard drive. It is, if I go to my properties, this is a 14 terabyte hard drive because I filled a few of these up already, which is a ton of information. But this is for my work, right? Because I work with clients. And so, but this is like my external hard drive, right? And all of my projects live on this external hard drive so that I can unplug this and take this anywhere I need to go. I also have these backed up in other places. You should usually have 2 copies of stuff at all times. So if you wanted to keep some on one external hard drive and another on another, or keep things on your desk or on your computer in your downloads folder or documents or on your desktop, that's fine. I just suggest, my biggest thing is once you pick a place, keep it in that place. Keep your stuff there, because then you're not like, oh, I'm putting it, it's like putting stuff all around your house, right? And then when you go to want to grab it, you're like, oh, where did I put it? And so that's a big thing. But yeah, we've gone over a lot tonight. I know it is a lot to take in. And so I want you guys to just kind of get into After Effects and start playing around in there. Just remembering that we're always working, our compositions should always be 24 frames a second, 1920 by 1080. That's like the one thing you guys just need to get in your heads, which I know you will. You'll be fine. Sometimes you'll accidentally do that, but it's, here is something I want to say. Whenever you guys go into to turn in projects, always watch your videos before you turn in your projects. That way you can catch mistakes or any issues right away. Because I'll have a lot of students turn in things with a lot of blank video at the end, or it doesn't have any audio, or there's something not working. And that's because they thought they did it. They thought they rendered it out appropriately and just missed a few things. And then they turned it in and they get points deducted for that. So like, I'm just saying, whenever you create something and export it, you want to watch that export back before you submit it, right? But I'm pretty lenient on the grading thing. I have rubrics, which I'll show you about next week. So, but for this week, play around, test the program, right? Go off and test this. Try to recreate what I did with the ball, like kind of moving across the screen from different coordinates. Try testing that out. Maybe try making a ball move in that kind of roller coaster like fashion that I did, up and down and up and down. And just play around and have fun. Bring some different images into there. Bring movies if you can, or like videos. If you record a video on your phone, you can try and bring that in there. I will say this, videos on your phone end up being recorded. They have weird settings, so just don't be surprised by the settings. Will seem odd, but you know, just try and bring things in, importing things, getting used to file structure, and bringing things onto your timeline and playing within those transform properties. And then I know a lot of you have already done your syllabus quiz, but there are a handful of students that have not done their syllabus quiz. And according to GCC's new guidelines, you guys have to have that done by tomorrow. It's always by the first Friday of the first week of class. So that will be tomorrow at midnight. You guys have to have that done or I have to like drop you from it. And it has to do with like financial aid or something like that. I don't know. They didn't fully explain it to me, but so definitely take that, because if you get dropped from the course, I have to try and re-enroll you and it can be a big, a big hassle. We don't want to do that, right? We want you guys to have access to everything right away. So take that quiz. If you have not, it's just a yes or no. And then the technology login challenge, which is due, I changed that, due date. Well, I didn't change the due date, but I did change how long it's available for you guys until. And so, it's due Friday by midnight, but you guys have until the 28th, which is Monday at midnight, right? To turn that in. Those of you who already have turned it in, great. That's awesome. Now you get more time to play around in After Effects, right? And then if you have not if you posted your stuff into Slack but didn't put any like images, artwork, or anything, go back and do that, because I just want you guys to get used to showing your art. And don't, take pride in it too. I want you guys to be proud of what you've done. So I've seen a lot of really impressive stuff in there. I think you guys are going to do good in class. Do you have any questions before we head off? Big project starts next, or your first project. It's not the big one. The big ones come halfway through the semester, but I hope you guys are excited. The overwhelming feeling goes away in the next couple weeks, okay? I just want you guys to know. I noticed that's a lie. It's like scary. All of the information and in pulling up After Effects and all these different programs that are super deep. What kind of, oh, here's a great thing. Lena said that she was having an issue with Cinema 4D. If you guys are having issues with your programs, which it happens often, there are a lot of bugs in these programs. And if you get an error code, screenshot that error code and send it to me, and I can try and troubleshoot where the issue is. What was there any kind of error code that came up for you, Lena, when you were trying to open the app or anything? Did it say anything? Did it just not open? Were you not able to find it? Here, let me see. You didn't get an error code. Okay. Were you just not able to find the app at all? Oh, my webcam's been off the whole time. I'm sorry, guys. Okay. I'm so sorry. I just kind of yelled into the mic after I took a drink. So what you can do is, are you on the computer that has Cinema 4D right now? If you go to your search bar and type in Maxon, it will pop up, and then you should be able to click on it and access it that way. And then I'll show you kind of what to do once that pops up. If you're working on the same computer, try it right now and see if that works. Because it just doesn't save it to like your desktop or anything right away. I'm going to move this over here. I'm going to close this out. Try what I just did. Go to that little search icon down there and just type in Maxon. Cool. Sweet. How's everyone else doing? Nakara, Keith, are you guys doing cool? Do you guys have anything you want to ask? Oh, sweet. Awesome. Wait, before you close it, I do want you to see this though. If you right click, if like down here in your toolbar, if you right click, you can pin it. Right now mine says unpin because mine's already pinned there, but you'll want to pin to taskbar and it'll pin it down here at the bottom for you. That's why I have like my Adobe, I have all this stuff done because I can access it really quickly. So all of your programs, if you open them up and you want it down here on your toolbar, just right click and pin it to your taskbar. Cool. Sweet, Keith. Nice. Well, if everyone's good, I'm going to cut it a couple minutes short tonight. Yeah. Next week, we'll start our first project with the bouncing balls. Have fun playing around inside of After Effects. I just want you guys really just getting used to transform properties and moving things around on screen and like putting things on screen. So just try importing some different files, try adding some different shapes, seeing what kind of options you have with the different shapes, because you can make stars, you can, ellipses, rectangles, all sorts of stuff. So other than that, I hope you guys have a good weekend, good first weekend. And I will talk to you guys on Tuesday. And if you have any issues in between, just send me a message on Slack. But have a good weekend, guys. Bye.